Men who had survived Kursk, who had watched friends die in ways they could never describe back home, learned a new kind of fear in the summer of 1944. It came out of a sky too overcast for aircraft, or so they believed. There was no siren, no warning shot, no moment to prepare. Only the sudden scream of a huge radial engine falling out of the clouds, and then the world erupting into fire. German soldiers gave this thing a name. They called it Jabo Tod, death by fighter bomber, because ordinary words could not hold what it felt like to be hunted from above with nowhere to hide. Men who had faced Soviet tanks and artillery barrages that turned the earth into a moonscape said this was worse. This was the thing that convinced entire units the war in the West was already lost. Yet 3 years earlier, when this same aircraft first appeared over Western Europe, German pilots did not fear it at all. They laughed. They called it a flying barrel, too big, too heavy, too clumsy to survive against sleek German fighters. What happened between that laughter and that terror is the story of an immigrant engineer who built a machine almost nobody believed in, and a farm boy from Oklahoma who should never have been cleared for combat. Together they turned a joke into the most dreaded shape in the sky over France. The morning was overcast over Normandy, the kind of gray that usually kept aircraft grounded. A column of German infantry moved along a narrow farm road, boots sinking into mud between the tall hedgerows that turned this part of France into a maze of blind corners and ambush points. They were marching to reinforce the coastal defenses, tired men who had already survived years of the worst fighting Europe had ever produced. Then the sky tore open above them. There was no siren, no distant drone building slowly closer. There was only the sudden shriek of engines that seemed to fall out of the clouds themselves, and a heartbeat later the road erupted into fire. Men dove into ditches without thinking, pressing themselves into the mud as machine gun fire chewed through the column. The air filled with the smell of scorched hedgerow and burning fuel, and for a few seconds the world was reduced to noise, dirt, and the certainty that the next burst would find them. Some never got up again. The survivors would carry the sound of those engines for the rest of their lives, a memory that would return unbidden decades later at the sound of any low-flying aircraft. The Germans had a name for what was hunting them. They called it a Jabo, short for Jagbomber, fighter bomber. But this particular Jabo had another name, one that within a year would be spoken with something close to dread across every German unit in France. The Americans called it the P-47 Thunderbolt. What is strange is that nobody expected this aircraft to become a terror weapon. When German pilots first met it over Western Europe in April of 1943, they laughed. Luftwaffe pilots watching the new American fighter climb toward their formations at 25,000 feet radioed their wingmen with open amusement. The Americans, they joked, were flying barrels. It was an easy joke to make. Next to the sleek Messerschmitt 109 or the deadly agile Focke-Wulf 190, the Thunderbolt looked almost comical. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, close to twice the weight of any other single-engine fighter in the sky. Its fuselage was so wide and deep that American pilots themselves nicknamed it the Jug, short for milk jug. German pilots called it the Razorback for the angular shape of its canopy. Even the men who flew it wondered what their commanders had been thinking, strapping them into a machine that looked designed by committee rather than by any serious aeronautical mind. Early combat reports seemed to confirm the mockery. The Thunderbolt could not turn with nimble German fighters. Its rate of climb was unremarkable. It seemed too big, too heavy, too clumsy to survive in a world where speed and agility were the only things standing between a pilot and a fiery death. The man responsible for this apparent monstrosity was Alexander Kartveli, born in Tbilisi, Georgia, in 1896. He had left his homeland in 1919 on a government scholarship to study aeronautical engineering in Paris. When Soviet forces occupied Georgia 2 years later, he could never go home. He made his way first to France, then to the United States, eventually landing at the Republic Aviation Corporation on Long Island, New York. Kartveli understood something his critics did not. He was not building an aircraft to win a graceful aerial duel. He was building a machine meant to survive punishment that would destroy anything else in the sky and bring its pilot home regardless. Where other designers chased elegance, Kartveli chose brutality and endurance. He had spent years watching his adopted country's aviation industry obsess over speed and grace, and he had come to believe that a fighter's most important quality was not how it performed on its best day, but whether it could still fly on its worst. He built his design around the Pratt & Whitney R2800, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower, the most powerful aircraft engine available at the time. To keep that engine breathing at high altitude, he installed a turbo supercharger in the rear fuselage, connected by ductwork that ran the length of the aircraft. It added weight and complexity, but gave the Thunderbolt extraordinary performance above 20,000 feet, exactly where American bombers needed protection most. Then he armed it almost to excess. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, with 425 rounds per gun. Firing together, those 8 guns could put roughly 100 rounds per second into a target zone 6 feet wide. A single 3-second burst could cut a fighter in half or turn a truck into burning wreckage. When skeptics asked whether such a massive airframe could really fight, Kartveli reportedly smiled and said it would be a dinosaur. But it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. The prototype first flew on May 6, 1941. Despite an engine fire that forced an emergency landing, the test pilot declared they had struck gold. Its dive speed alone was extraordinary. The first Thunderbolts reached England in January of 1943 with the 56th Fighter Group, soon known as Zemke's Wolfpack after its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke. Pilots arriving from nimble Spitfires were unimpressed. The Thunderbolt lost so often in mock dogfights against the British fighter that commanders eventually banned the exercise, worried it was destroying morale before the war had even begun for them. Some pilots privately wondered if they had been handed a death sentence rather than a fighter. Zemke understood the problem before most. He had served as an observer with the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain and had watched brave pilots die trying to fight the way tradition demanded rather than the way survival required. He built new tactics around the Thunderbolt's real strengths, its diving speed past 450 miles per hour, and its unmatched ability to absorb punishment. Stay high, avoid turning fights, dive from above, fire, and climb back to altitude before the enemy could respond. Never let the Germans dictate the terms of the fight. Among the young pilots who arrived under Zemke's command was a 23-year-old named Robert Samuel Johnson, a farm boy from Lawton, Oklahoma, who had dreamed of flying since he was 8 years old, sitting on his father's shoulders at an air show, watching biplanes roll and dive against an open Oklahoma sky. He had worked at a cabinet shop for $4 a week to pay for flying lessons, logging 35 hours before his 16th birthday. He enrolled in a civilian pilot training program while attending junior college, and when the war came, he enlisted without hesitation. His path to the cockpit had not been smooth. He was first trained as a bomber pilot and had to fight for a transfer to fighters. His gunnery scores in training were so poor, just above 4% accuracy against towed targets, that he technically should never have been cleared for combat at all. The Army needed pilots, and Johnson was determined to prove the number wrong. On June 26, 1943, Johnson was flying bomber escort over northern France when his flight was ambushed by Focke-Wulf 190 fighters diving out of the sun exactly as German doctrine demanded, invisible until the last possible second. In moments, Johnson's Thunderbolt was torn apart. Cannon shells ripped through his fuselage, shattered his canopy, and sent shrapnel into his face and leg. Fire broke out in the cockpit. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across what remained of his windscreen. The engine began trailing smoke. Johnson tried to bail out. The damaged canopy would not budge. He pushed, pulled, hammered at it with bloody fists. Nothing worked. He was trapped in a burning, crippled aircraft, 20,000 feet above enemy territory, with no way out. Then a lone German fighter pulled alongside, having emptied its cannon ammunition in the first pass, but not yet finished. The pilot began methodically pumping machine gun rounds into Johnson's aircraft, pass after pass, determined to finish what he had started. Johnson pressed himself behind the inch-thick armor plate at his back and watched the tracers flash by, unable to do anything else. His guns were empty. His controls barely responded. By every law of aerial combat, he should already have been dead. The German pilot made 3 more passes. Each time bullets slammed into the Thunderbolt. Each time the big radial engine coughed, sputtered, and kept turning. Finally, the German pulled alongside one last time, close enough for Johnson to see him shaking his head in open disbelief at an aircraft that refused to fall out of the sky. He rocked his wings in something like salute and turned for home. He had done everything right, and it had not been enough. Johnson nursed his shattered Thunderbolt back across the English Channel, certain the engine would seize at any moment. It never did. He crossed the water low and alone, blood drying on his face, expecting every mile to be his last, yet the big engine kept turning beneath him with a stubbornness that felt almost alive. When he landed at an emergency field on the Kent coast, ground crews gathered around the wreck in stunned silence and counted more than 200 bullet holes. Several cylinders had been shot clean off the engine, the hydraulic and electrical systems were wrecked, and the cockpit was scorched black from fire. The aircraft would never fly again, but Johnson walked away alive, with wounds that would heal. He would later say he owed his life to Alexander Kartvel's Dinosaur. He returned to combat, and by the time his tour ended in May of 1944, he had shot down 27 German aircraft, becoming the first American pilot to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's First World War record. The aircraft that Luftwaffe pilots had mocked as a flying barrel had just proven it could take everything they threw at it and bring its pilot home. But its true transformation, the one that would make it feared by every German soldier in Europe, had not yet begun. In March of 1944, Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group brought his commanders an unusual and dangerous request. Duncan was a Texan, rangy and aggressive, already an ace with a growing reputation for unconventional thinking. He wanted permission to test whether the Thunderbolt, a machine built to protect bombers at 25,000 feet, could instead be brought down to treetop level to attack German troops and equipment directly on the ground. The idea seemed close to reckless. At altitude, the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger gave it every advantage: room to see an enemy coming from miles away, and altitude to trade for speed in a diving attack. Down low, none of that mattered. Down low, it would be exposed to rifle fire, machine guns, and every anti-aircraft position the Germans could bring to bear, flying slow and level for just long enough to line up a target, the very conditions that got fighter pilots killed. Ground attack was supposed to be a job for light bombers, built and armored for exactly that kind of punishment. Not an expensive fighter flown by a highly trained pilot the Army Air Forces had spent a year training to fight in the air. Duncan found 16 volunteers who believed the big jug could do more than escort bombers home. He studied approach angles, worked out how to time a strafing run, and how to avoid the flak that would certainly rise to meet them. The risk was real and immediate. Coming down to treetop height meant flying through a zone where every German soldier with a rifle became in effect an air defense gunner, and where light flak batteries could track a diving aircraft far more easily than one passing overhead at altitude. Duncan and his volunteers took their Thunderbolts down anyway, testing the theory against real targets in German-occupied France, learning through trial which approach angles gave a gun crew the least time to react, and which left an attacking pilot exposed a second too long. A fellow pilot later remembered Duncan as one of those rare men who inspire everyone around them to exceed what they believed possible. A commander who never asked anyone to take a risk he had not already taken himself. After 5 missions proved the concept could work, Duncan's volunteers returned to their units to teach what they had learned, and the air war over Europe changed shape. It turned out that everything which made the Thunderbolt look ridiculous in a dogfight made it devastating at ground attack. The massive engine could absorb tremendous damage and keep running. Being air-cooled, it had no vulnerable coolant lines waiting to be punctured by a lucky rifle shot the way a liquid-cooled engine did. Self-sealing fuel tanks resisted fire even from incendiary rounds. Armor plating protected the pilot from the small arms fire that would have brought down a lighter aircraft in an instant. And those 850 caliber machine guns, once dismissed as excessive for aerial combat, proved just as lethal against trucks, half-tracks, and infantry caught in the open. A 2-second burst could destroy a vehicle or silence an artillery crew outright. Loaded with bombs or rockets that pilots nicknamed Holy Moses for the force of their impact, a single flight of 4 Thunderbolts could deliver more firepower in one pass than an entire battery of field guns, and place it exactly where it was needed, when it was needed, far more precisely than anything fired from the ground. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the 9th Air Force had 13 fighter groups flying Thunderbolts tailored specifically for this new mission. They had become the flying artillery of the invasion, capable of reaching a target 30 miles behind the lines faster than any battery of guns could be repositioned to reach it, and delivering a concentration of fire that a divisional artillery commander could only have dreamed of matching from the ground. They were about to make daily life unbearable for the German army in France. The 365th Fighter Group, known as the Hellhawks, was among the most effective of these units. On D-Day itself, their pilots crossed the channel before dawn, climbing through cloud and flak, to strike German positions just inland from the beaches. One pilot, flying a Thunderbolt named after his wife back home, remembered finding only murky gray light over the water, then looking down over Omaha Beach to see vehicles and bodies scattered across the sand and surf, a scene of destruction larger than anything he had imagined from briefings alone. Flying in near treetop level, he passed the wreckage of the airborne assault that had gone in hours earlier. Gliders broken open in the hedgerows, a paratrooper hanging motionless from a tree. Then his flight spotted German Tiger tanks moving toward the beach. If those tanks reached the landing zones, if they got in among the men and supplies still coming ashore, the invasion itself could be thrown into crisis. The flight leader, a stocky captain known for smoking a cigar on takeoff against every regulation in the book, rolled his Thunderbolt over and led the attack down through scattered flak. One after another, the aircraft dove, released their bombs, and pulled up hard over the hedgerows before circling back for another pass. Within minutes, the column of tanks that had threatened to reach the beach was left burning in the fields short of the coast, and the invasion continued. 3 weeks later, the group had already moved to a forward airstrip in France, flying mission after mission in support of American troops fighting yard by yard through the hedgerow country. Pilots ate meals in their cockpits between sorties and slept when exhaustion left them no choice. For German soldiers on the ground, the change in the air war was immediate, and it was terrifying. The pace demanded of the American pilots flying these missions was relentless in its own right. Many flew several sorties in a single day, landing only long enough to rearm and refuel before climbing back into the same cockpit still warm from the last mission. Ground crews worked through the night under blackout conditions to have aircraft ready before first light, and pilots grew accustomed to eating cold rations between flights rather than losing the daylight hours that made their attacks possible. It was not a war fought in dramatic, isolated encounters so much as one fought in an unbroken rhythm of takeoff, attack, return, and take off again, day after day, for weeks that stretched into months. Nor was the mission without its own moral weight for the men flying it. Not every target on a retreating German column was mechanized. Retreating supply trains still relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons, and pilots ordered to prevent any column from reaching the front had no way to sort horses from trucks in the middle of a diving attack at 300 miles an hour. One Thunderbolt pilot who flew these missions later called the strafing of horse-drawn transport one of the saddest duties of the war, insisting that the animals were not the enemy, only casualties of an order that had to be carried out regardless. It was a small detail in a much larger campaign, but it captured something true about the war being fought in French skies that summer. A war in which the distance and speed that made an attack effective also made it impossible to be selective in the way a soldier on the ground might have been. An American tank destroyer crewman near a town called St. Gilles later described watching one such attack from below. His unit was bracing for a German armored counterattack, nerves already stretched thin, when the distinctive roar of Thunderbolt engines rolled in overhead. 12 aircraft in formation began what he called the most devastating strafing attack he witnessed in the entire war. The first plane went in low, strafing, and if the pilot saw a worthy target, released a bomb. Then the second came right behind it, then the third, then the fourth, and by the time the last aircraft in the formation finished its run, the first was already circling back to begin again. It felt endless, a continuous rain of fire that seemed to have no end and no mercy. The counterattack the Germans had been forming never materialized. The tanks meant to spearhead it were left burning across the Norman countryside. German soldiers coped with the constant threat from above by turning it into grim humor, the kind of joke that only makes sense to men who have run out of other ways to talk about fear. If an aircraft was camouflaged, they said, it was British. If it was bare polished metal, it was American. And if you could not see anything in the sky at all, that meant it was German, because by the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively been swept from the skies over France. Ground troops were left almost entirely without air cover of their own, exposed at any moment of daylight to attack from above, living daily with what they had already come to call job otad. It was not a small caliber threat, and the results were rarely survivable. Men were cut down by 50 caliber fire, burned by incendiary rounds, or crushed under the wreckage of vehicles destroyed around them, with no warning and no real defense. The toll among German commanders in those first weeks was staggering. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, was killed on June 12 when his staff car was strafed while he was traveling toward the front. Lieutenant General Heinz Hellmich of the 243rd Infantry Division was killed by aircraft attack on June 17. Major General Rudolf Stegmann of the 77th Infantry Division died in a similar attack the following day. General Wilhelm Falley, commander of the 91st Air Landing Division, was killed by American paratroopers in an ambush on his staff car on the night of the invasion itself. Not every senior officer lost in those weeks fell to aircraft. Brigade Führer Fritz Witt of the 12th SS Panzer Division was killed on June 14th by Royal Navy gunfire, striking his command post, a reminder that Allied air and naval power together, not air power alone, had turned the invasion front into a killing ground for German leadership at every level. In the space of barely 2 weeks, the German army in Normandy had lost more general and flag officers than most armies expected to lose in a full campaign, a rate of attrition among senior commanders that made it difficult to keep divisions properly led at the very moment they needed steady leadership most. The psychological toll on the German high command matched the physical losses. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, later told his Allied captors that Allied air attacks made it nearly impossible to move a single train across the Rhine in daylight. It was an exaggeration born of frustration, but it captured something real. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement troops that should have taken a day to reach the front by rail or road now took 3 or 4, arriving late and often incomplete, if they arrived at all. Every road had become a potential killing ground. Every convoy, every staff car, every column of reinforcements moving up to the front was a target waiting to be found. And German logistics officers learned to plan entire movements around the hours of darkness, cramming days' worth of movement into a handful of hours between dusk and dawn. By late July, the campaign had reached the moment American planners had been waiting for since the beaches. Weeks of grinding, hedgerow by hedgerow fighting around St. Lo had worn down the German defense to the point of collapse, and Operation Cobra was designed to finally break the front open and turn a static battle of attrition into a war of movement, one in which fast-moving American armor, covered constantly from above by Thunderbolts, could outrun any German attempt to form a new defensive line. On July 29, 1944, during that same offensive, a German column found itself trapped near the village of Ronce, caught between advancing American armored divisions with nowhere left to run. Thunderbolts of the 405th Fighter Group found them first. From 3:10 in the afternoon until 9:40 that evening, more than 6 hours without pause, wave after wave dove on the trapped column, dropping bombs, firing rockets, raking the road with machine gun fire. With no air cover and no way to escape the narrow lanes, the Germans were caught in a killing ground with no way out. Pilots who flew that afternoon and evening described a strange rhythm to the destruction. One aircraft peeling off to strafe or drop its bomb, climbing away and circling back into line behind the others, so that by the time the last Thunderbolt in a flight had finished its run, the first was already lined up to begin again. From above, the column below seemed to stop moving entirely within the first hour, reduced to a stationary line of burning vehicles that later flights simply worked over again and again until nothing remained capable of moving. When investigators reached the wreckage afterward, they counted 66 tanks destroyed, 204 other vehicles wrecked, and 11 artillery pieces demolished, one of the most devastating single-day tallies produced by fighter bombers in the entire war. The roads were left choked with burning metal and the bodies of men and horses. Worse followed in August. Adolf Hitler ordered a desperate counterattack near Mortain, throwing his remaining panzer divisions against the American line in an attempt to cut off the breakout and reach the sea. The operation was codenamed Lüttich, and for a few hours, under cover of early morning fog, it seemed to threaten real success. German tanks pushed several miles into the American position before the weather began to lift, but Allied commanders had been forewarned by intercepted German radio traffic, and they had the Thunderbolts waiting on airfields close behind the front, engines ready, pilots briefed on exactly where the German spearhead was expected to appear. When the skies cleared on August 7th, wave after wave of fighter bombers descended on the German columns concentrated for the attack, catching tanks and support vehicles bunched together on narrow roads, targets the pilots could hardly miss even in the first pass. Within 24 hours, the threat at Mortain had collapsed, and the German force that had pushed forward found itself in a far worse position than before it had attacked, its own offensive having delivered its divisions straight into the encirclement that was about to close around them. What remained of the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army now found themselves encircled near the town of Falaise. Somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in a pocket that shrank by the hour under constant ground and air attack. The roads leading out became killing grounds the survivors would never forget. German troops called the area a fighter-bomber racecourse, for the Thunderbolts that seemed to circle overhead without pause, one flight relieving another, so that at almost any hour of daylight, there was an aircraft somewhere above the pocket, waiting for something below to move. One German corporal later wrote that the fighter bombers had become a weight on their souls, that there was no escape from them and no moment that felt safe, that any movement at all invited fire from above. When Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower visited the battlefield, after it was finally secured, he later wrote that it was unquestionably one of the greatest killing grounds of the entire war, a place where it was possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but the dead. A British liaison officer who toured the same roads described them as choked with wreckage and the swollen bodies of men and horses, uniforms plastered to blackened tanks, the stench carried for miles on the summer wind. Neither man was a stranger to the sights of a battlefield, and both had walked away shaken by what they found in the lanes leading out of the pocket, a scale of destruction that seemed to belong to a different kind of war altogether. The German army lost an estimated 60,000 men at Falaise, roughly 10,000 killed and 50,000 captured, along with hundreds of tanks and assault guns abandoned or destroyed. The survivors who escaped east fled with almost none of their heavy equipment, abandoning trucks, guns, and tanks along roadsides for lack of fuel to move them any further. The German army in the West had been gutted, and it would never fully recover for the remainder of the war in France. The lesson of Falaise was not lost on the Germans who came after. In September of 1944, as American armor pushed east across France, a sizable German force threatening the flank of the advance found itself under days of sustained attack from squadrons of Thunderbolts, with almost no cover and no way to strike back at the aircraft hunting them. Cut off from supply, unable to move by day, and battered without pause from above, the German commander eventually chose to surrender his force rather than watch it destroyed piecemeal on the roads. Word of the surrender spread quickly among the pilots who had flown the mission, most of whom had never fired a shot in anger during those final days, having instead simply kept the German position sealed and helpless from above until resistance no longer made sense to the men trapped inside it. It was one of the rare moments in the war when air power alone, without a major ground assault to force the issue, decided the outcome of an entire encirclement, a fact that spread quickly through the ranks and did nothing to ease the dread already settling over German units elsewhere along the front. None of this dominance came without cost to the Americans flying it. German gunners on the ground adapted quickly to the new threat, ringing supply routes and bridges with light and medium flak batteries, specifically to counter the low-flying attacks. In time, it was this ground fire, not enemy fighters, that accounted for the great majority of Thunderbolts lost over France. A pilot diving on a target at treetop height had only seconds to make his attack and pull away before he was well within range of every gun on the ground below him, and pilots who flew dozens of these missions came to accept that the greatest danger they faced no longer came from the sky at all, but from the very ground they were trying to clear for the men following behind them. For the men trapped inside pockets like Falaise, survival became a matter of learning to live underground and to move only in darkness. Soldiers dug deeper into hedgerows and ditches during daylight hours, sometimes remaining motionless for hours at a stretch rather than risk drawing the attention of a circling thunderbolt. Some later described a specific and lasting flinch reflex, a full-body reaction to the sound of any low-flying aircraft engine that stayed with them for the rest of their lives, long after the war had ended and the skies over Germany had gone quiet again. Whole units reported a creeping sense that daylight itself had become the enemy, that the sun overhead was no longer a comfort but a warning, and that safety only returned with dusk. Yet for all this dominance, there remained one gap in the system that German commanders had noticed and would try to exploit before the year was out. The Thunderbolt could not fly through weather it could not see through. Rain, fog, and low cloud grounded it as effectively as any anti-aircraft gun, and every German officer who had lived through the summer of 1944 understood that the next time their army moved to attack in the West, it would have to happen under skies too poor for the jugs to fly. In December of 1944, Adolf Hitler gambled on the one weakness his officers had noted since the summer, and planned his last major offensive in the West for the depths of winter. His generals argued that they no longer had the resources for such an operation. Hitler overruled them, certain that low cloud and heavy snow would keep the Thunderbolts grounded long enough for his panzer divisions to punch through the American line in the Ardennes forest and reach the port of Antwerp. For the first few days, the weather obeyed him. Fog, snow, and heavy cloud sat over the forest day after day, and German armor poured through gaps in the thinly held American front, while the Thunderbolts sat useless on airfields further back, engines cold, pilots grounded and restless, unable to see the ground well enough to fly even a single sortie. American units fell back in confusion, and a dangerous bulge opened in the Allied line that would give the battle its name. For a few days, it seemed as though Hitler's gamble on the weather might actually work, that the one gap in the Thunderbolt's dominance he had waited months to exploit would be enough to turn the war in the West back in his favor. Then, on December 23rd, the skies cleared. American fighter bombers rose from their airfields in numbers. Engines that had sat silent for days finally turning over into the cold morning air, searching the roads winding through the snow-covered hills and dark pine forests around the town of Bastogne and the surrounding country. What they found left even experienced pilots staring in disbelief. A German column stretched for miles along roads never built to carry that much traffic at once. Tanks, trucks, artillery, horse-drawn wagons, and thousands of soldiers jammed together in the kind of traffic that the narrow Ardennes roads could not absorb, all of it moving in the open, in daylight, for the first time since the offensive had begun. The Thunderbolts went to work, diving through gaps in the remaining cloud to strafe and bomb a column with nowhere to scatter and no cover thick enough to hide behind in a landscape stripped bare by winter. By the end of that single day of clear skies, one fighter group alone had destroyed more than 100 vehicles and artillery pieces, with dozens more left wrecked or burning along the roadside. The roads that had carried the German spearhead forward became impassable, choked with burning trucks and abandoned guns that blocked movement in either direction. The offensive that had opened with such promise under cover of fog stalled in the snow, starved of the fuel and ammunition that could no longer reach it, its momentum broken in a single afternoon of clear weather that Hitler's planners had gambled would never come in time to matter. German troops trapped in that advance experienced the same terror their comrades had known in Normandy 6 months earlier, only now framed against white snow instead of green hedgerows, the black smoke of burning vehicles rising into a clear winter sky that offered no cover at all. Soldiers who had believed the weather would protect them through the whole operation instead found themselves caught in the open at the worst possible moment, with clear skies revealing exactly what Hitler's plan had depended on hiding. The Germans tried one final stroke against the aircraft themselves. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched a surprise attack against Allied airfields using nearly 1,000 aircraft, the largest German air operation since the Battle of Britain. Many Thunderbolts were caught on the ground at bases in France and Belgium, and more than 200 Allied aircraft were destroyed in the opening minutes before ground crews and anti-aircraft gunners could properly respond. But the victory was hollow. The Luftwaffe lost close to 300 aircraft of its own in the operation, along with pilots who could not be replaced at any price, many of them shot down by their own anti-aircraft batteries, which had not been warned in time that German aircraft would be filling the skies that morning. American factories could turn out new Thunderbolts within weeks, rolling off the same Long Island production lines that had been building them since 1942. Germany could not replace the veteran pilots it had just spent, and this attack marked the last time the Luftwaffe would mount a significant offensive operation in the West. After the Battle of the Bulge broke apart in the snow, German resistance began to crumble in earnest, and the Thunderbolts ranged ahead of the advancing Allied armies for the rest of the war, hunting anything that dared move on German roads and railways in daylight, leaving the German rail network in ruins by the time Allied ground troops crossed the Rhine. The scale of destruction across the whole campaign, from the landings in Normandy to victory in Europe in May of 1945, is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. Thunderbolt pilots flew more than 500,000 combat sorties over the course of the war, credited with destroying tens of thousands of railroad cars, thousands of locomotives, thousands of armored vehicles, and tens of thousands of trucks, along with thousands of enemy aircraft caught in the air and on the ground. The aircraft that German pilots had once mocked as a flying barrel ended the war with a favorable kill ratio in the air that few other fighters could match, and that tally does not begin to account for what it did to German ground forces below. Robert Johnson, the Oklahoma farm boy whose gunnery scores should never have cleared him to fly a fighter at all, finished his combat tour with 27 confirmed victories, becoming the first American pilot of the war to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's record from the previous conflict, a record that had stood for a generation. He flew 91 combat missions in total and never lost faith in the aircraft that had carried him home on the day he should have died over France. He returned home in June of 1944 and spent months touring the country to sell war bonds before joining Republic Aviation, where his first assignment was redesigning the very cockpit he had once bled inside, using what he had learned in combat to make the next generation of pilots safer. He worked for the company for nearly 2 decades afterward and would spend the rest of his life speaking to young people about the war, insisting until the end that he owed his survival not to skill alone, but to the aircraft Alexander Kartveli had built. Glenn Duncan, the Texan who had first proven the Thunderbolt could fight as well on the ground as in the air, was shot down by flak while leading a strafing mission over a German airfield in July of 1944. The very kind of low-altitude attack he had pioneered himself. He brought his burning aircraft down in a field, tossed a grenade into the wreck so the Germans could not study it, and walked away on foot toward the Netherlands rather than surrender. He spent 10 months hidden by the Dutch resistance, moving between safe houses and living on the edge of capture every day, before Allied forces finally reached him in the spring of 1945. He returned to duty to command the very fighter group he had once led into combat, and he retired from the United States Air Force years later as a colonel. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian immigrant whose dinosaur had once been laughed out of the sky, never received during his lifetime anything close to the recognition his creation had earned. He went on to design a line of jet fighters for the post-war Air Force, carrying forward the same philosophy of rugged, punishing endurance that had defined his first great success. He died in 1974, having spent 3 decades shaping American air power from behind a drafting table few Americans would ever know his name from. Decades after his death, when officers were choosing a name for a new aircraft built for exactly the mission Glenn Duncan had proven at treetop level over Normandy, they looked back at history and gave it the same name Kartveli had once defended in front of skeptical generals who doubted a fighter so heavy could ever earn its place in the sky. That aircraft still flies in American service today, low and slow over troops on the ground, built to take punishment and keep flying, carrying his name into a new century. For the soldiers who had faced the Thunderbolt from below, the fear it left behind did not end when the war did. German veterans who had survived Normandy often spoke of the fighter bombers decades later with something between fear and a strange, reluctant respect, an instinctive flinch at the sound of low-flying aircraft that some carried for the rest of their lives, long after the hedgerows had grown back over the roads where they had once dived for cover. One German fighter pilot who had once dismissed the aircraft as a joke offered a very different verdict by the end of the war, calling it the finest fighter bomber Germany ever faced, one whose guns never seemed to jam and never seemed to stop, an aircraft flown by men who kept coming back no matter how much fire was thrown up to meet them. They had laughed at it in 1943, when it first lumbered into the sky over England, looking too heavy and too strange to survive against anything Germany could put up against it. By 1945, nobody in the German army was laughing anymore. For American soldiers on the ground, the sight of that broad silver shape overhead had come to mean something entirely different, not a joke and not a threat, but a promise that help had arrived, that whatever was coming for them would be met first from above. The dinosaur had grown teeth, and those teeth had torn apart an army that once believed nothing in the sky could touch it.